All right, so this is the start of our last set of videos on time period 4. And for those of you that are keeping track of this stuff, this is chapter 27. And this is the last area of the world that we need to look at in time period 4. So here we're going to look at the Dar al-Islam, or the Islamic world. And so in these 3 videos, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 different Islamic empires. We're going to look at the Ottoman Empire here in this video. We're going to look at the Safavid Empire, which is the government of Persia in time period 4. And then we're going to look finally at the Mughal Empire, which is what's going on in India in time period 4. So we're going to look at these 3 places in these videos. So in this video, we're going to start with the Ottomans. Now, before we get into a discussion of the Ottoman Empire, I think we've got to do a little bit of context here. So let's do a little bit of context for what we're doing here. So far, what we've been doing when we've been looking at time period 4 is we've been looking at what the Europeans have done to the world after they managed to cut out the Islamic merchants and the Islamic middlemen. So the question that we're asking here is, so the Europeans were successful. What happened to the Islamic world as a result of European exploration? So that's what we're looking at here. The Europeans wanted to cut out the Islamic middlemen and hopefully replace them. They did. So now the question is, what happened to the Islamic world as a result of that? You spent all this time looking at what the Europeans managed to do, but what's the other side of the equation? What happened to the Islamic world? So, to kind of give a brief answer to that question, like what we saw in East Asia, in China and Japan, these empires will focus on stability and keeping what they have rather than trying to innovate. So that's what these empires are going to try to do. They're going to try to focus on stability and keeping what they have rather than trying to innovate and change based on what happened. They're also going to try to interact with the Europeans. So they're not going to cut themselves off like what we saw in East Asia. They're going to interact with the Europeans. But the relationship has now flipped. It was the Europeans who were being taken advantage of by the Islamic merchants. Now, the Europeans will take advantage of the Islamic empires. So, long story short, at the end of all of this stuff, this is the end result. But now let's take a look at some of the examples of this. So we're going to start today with the Ottomans. So let's talk about the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans have kind of been involved in our story for a while now, but now we're actually going to pay attention to them specifically. So the Ottoman Empire kind of started around 1289 as nomadic Turkic people migrated into Anatolia, what we now know as Turkey. Now, Anatolia was kind of the heartland of the Byzantine Empire. And if you remember back to when we talked about the collapse of the Byzantines, it's the Ottomans that are going to finally kill off the Byzantine Empire. But starting around the late 1200s, these people are going to start migrating into the heartland of the Byzantine Empire. Now, these people, these Turkic people, wanted to be called, they wanted to be Ghazi. Now, a Ghazi is an Islamic religious warrior. And this concept should make sense given what we know about Turkic people, that a lot of their society is based on fighting and military strength. And so the ultimate position in Ottoman society would be one of these Islamic religious warriors. And given where they were, given their geographic position, they had lots of opportunities to fight. And a lot of this fighting is going to be at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. So they're going to do a lot of fighting against the Byzantines, and they are going to take a lot of Byzantine territory eventually, causing the ultimate collapse of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, when the Ottomans took Constantinople. So this is all, we've covered all of this stuff before, but now we're looking at it from the Ottoman point of view. Now, around this time, the Islamic Ottomans now have to govern Christians, because a lot of the people who lived in the Byzantine Empire were Christians. They were Orthodox Christians. So now that they've taken over big parts of the Byzantine Empire, so now they have Anatolia and Greece and pieces of Southeast Europe, they now have to govern Christians. So for the most part, Islamic governments treated other religions with a lot of tolerance. Like, that was one of the selling points of living in an Islamic society, is they pretty much let you do what you wanted as long as you paid that head tax, as long as you paid the tax. As long as you paid the tax for being a non-Muslim, you had religious freedom. The Ottomans had an additional tax. On the new Christian societies they governed. And this additional tax was called dev-shirmeh. So dev-shirmeh wasn't a money tax, it was a people tax. So Christian villages had to give young boys to the Ottoman government as slaves. Now, when we say slaves, we've been talking a lot about slavery, and this is not the same kind of slavery we're seeing on sugar plantations in the Caribbean or Brazil. They are slaves, but they are treated very well, because the point of these quote-unquote slaves is that they would be raised and trained to be government officials. And despite what you might think about this, many villages liked this because these children could benefit the village in the long run. Kind of the same way that mandarins could do the same thing in China. So mandarins are kind of like the same basic idea. Like, it's not, they are taken away from the family, but they're trained and educated, and they will become somebody who's important. So, yeah, they are taken as slaves, but they are government officials, and this is a chance at a high status position. So yes, it does sound bad, and it probably was psychologically damaging, but there's a chance that it could turn out to be pretty good in the long run. Now, the training for these children had two paths. So some of the children, depending on what they were good at, some became bureaucrats. So basically the same as the mandarins in China, some of these children became bureaucrats. But we're not going to worry about those guys, because in these Islamic societies, especially these Turkic Islamic societies, the ones that mattered more were the ones that became soldiers. And these are the guys that we want to focus on. So the children that became soldiers were called Janissaries. And the Janissaries are really important. The Janissaries were super loyal because they've been trained since little kids to want to follow the Sultan. And they were given the most advanced weapons and training. So the Janissaries were like the special forces. These are the best soldiers. They've been trained since they were little kids to be expert fighters. And that's what they became. And so with the Janissaries kind of leading the way, the Ottoman military became really successful. And as the Byzantine Empire collapses around them, they are able to take a lot of territory. So they are going to take most of what the Byzantines owned. So there are two important Ottoman leaders that we should probably know about. The first one of these guys is Mehmet the Conqueror. And Mehmet the Conqueror was conquering from 1451 to 1481, and he's the guy that took Constantinople. So that's how he got his title, as the Conqueror. The other guy that we should probably know, his name is Suleiman the Magnificent. And Suleiman the Magnificent is kind of the high point of the Ottoman Empire. So he's going to be Magnificent from 1520 to 1566. And under him, he's going to take a big piece of Eastern Europe. He's going to make it as far as Vienna, which is the capital of Austria. So right there in the middle of Europe, that's where he's going to get to. He's also going to be responsible for setting up the Ottoman Navy, and they're going to be in the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. So it's under Suleiman that the Ottoman Empire kind of becomes a more stabilizing force in Southeast Europe, Southwest Asia, kind of what we know as the Middle East. He is going to kind of stabilize this after the Europeans disrupt it by disrupting the trade networks. So what I want to do now is just kind of do a very brief examination of the governments of these Islamic empires. So just a very brief overview of what these Islamic empires' governments look like. Nothing here should come as a big surprise based on what we know about these Turkic societies. So this is kind of what we saw with those Turkic societies like the Mongols, but now they are no longer nomadic. And now that they're no longer nomadic, what are they going to look like? So these governments are complete and total absolute monarchies. The ruler, and here we're talking about all the Islamic rulers, in time period 4. Makes laws and enforces them as he sees fit, which is pretty much what you would expect in a nomadic society, but now we're no longer nomadic. We're just going to continue doing that. One of the problems in Turkic societies were succession problems. In Turkic societies, succession problems were common because it was just difficult to know who was going to follow unless you actually named a successor. There was all sorts of conflict that could arise if you didn't name a successor. So succession problems were common. And so what we see a lot of is that especially Ottoman rulers often killed their family members to prevent rebellions later in their rules, I guess, or in their reigns. This happened a lot. Now, it had to happen in a very specific way. You couldn't kill them by spilling any of their blood. So a lot of times these assassinations or murders, or however you want to describe them, were done through strangulation or smothering because you couldn't spill blood. the other thing that we should probably note about these Islamic empires is that the legitimacy of the rulers depended on two things. And if you've been paying attention, these two things should not come as a surprise. Their fighting skill. So in this case, are we expanding? The other thing is how faithful is the ruler? Like, how devout are they? So there's a lot of public displays of Islamic faith in all of these empires that we're talking about. So I'm going to stop there, mostly because I've run out of paper. So in the next video, we will look at the next one of these empires, the Safavid Empire in Persia. And we'll look at another aspect of these Islamic empires. So we'll look at the social and economic aspects of the empire. So we've looked at the political one here. We'll look at social and economic in the next one. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.